the striatum, which is shown in blue here, the caudate and the putamen. They receive input from the cortex, cortical inputs. So info is going to come down from the cortex to the striatum. After the striatum, input goes to the globus pallidus. So from the striatum to the globus pallidus. And then from the globus pallidus, it has to go back to the thalamus because it can't send information back to the cortex without stopping at the thalamus. The thalamus is basically the secretary of the cortex. And so once they reach the thalamus, it circuits back into the cortex once again. So this is basically how the basal ganglia functions. They influence the output of the cortex. They have no control over the actual lower motor neurons. They control the output that's coming out of the cortex itself. Now, let's see the putamen specifically. The inputs that come to the putamen are basically from your motor, premotor, supplementary motor, and your somatosensory cortex, obviously. The output that goes from the putamen goes back to these areas, basically the premotor and the supplementary motor. Okay? And it makes a stop in the thalamus, the nucleuses of VL and VA. Okay, this is to do with your putamen. If I'm going to talk about the caudate, it gets its input mainly from the association areas in the cortex. Okay? And the output goes to, so this is input, this is output. The output goes to the prefrontal cortex. Also by VA, the ventral anterior nucleus thalamus, but in this case it also uses DM, the dorsal medial nucleus of the thalamus. Now how do you remember this? Basically think of C being next to D. So DM is the one related to the output from the caudate nucleus. Both of them have to do with VA, and then, I don't know, just remember that putamen is also VL. L is kind of close to P in the alphabet. I guess you can use that if you want. Okay, let's talk a bit about the substantia nigra. Basically, it's in the midbrain. So if I'm going to draw the midbrain, I can't really draw the midbrain, but let's just assume this is the midbrain, okay? I have the crus cerebri here, okay? And then I have my red nucleus here. In between them is going to be my substantia nigra. So it's related to the cerebral peduncles or crus cerebri ventrally and the red nucleus dorsally. And there are two parts. You have compacta, which is really dense, and basically this is where the pigment actually lies. This is where the dopamine mainly comes out of. And then you have reticulata, which is lighter, basically. So the substantia nigra is in the midbrain, and it's located between your red nucleus and your crus cerebri. And you have two parts. You have compacta, which is dense and very highly pigmented, and this gives off dopamine, releases dopamine mainly. And then you have the second part, which is substantia nigra reticulata. And what the substantia nigra reticulata does is basically it gets the information from the striatum. So if we go back to this circuit here, the striatum sends information down to substantia nigra reticulata. Let's imagine reticulata being here. So this is reticulata. And then the striatum sends information down to reticulata, and reticulata sends fibers to the thalamus, to VA, VL, and DM. Sorry, this is a D. To VA, VL, DM, and then that goes back to the cortex. Or it can go to the superior colliculus and control eye movements. I don't really understand the connection, but I don't know, just memorize it. So the substantia nigra, you have two parts. You have substantia nigra compacta, which is responsible for sending dopaminergic fibers to the striatum. Dopamine. And then you have substantia nigra reticulata, which receives input from the striatum, and its output goes back to the thalamus to VA, VL, and DM, those three nuclei of the thalamus, or it can go to the superior colliculus and help in controlling eye movement. Now, another thing we have in the basal ganglia is the subthalamus. The subthalamus is basically located beneath your thalamus, and it's just underneath it, and its function is in the indirect circuit, which I'll talk about later, the indirect pathway. And it basically influences the output that comes out of globus pallidus internal. It gets its input from the external, and its output goes to the internal, so it can influence the output that comes out of it. And I'll explain it more when I talk about the circuits later. Before I go to the pathways, I just want to talk about the tracts that you need to know associated with the basal ganglia, the fibers. Most importantly, what you need to know is the fibers that come out of the globus pallidus and go to the thalamus. These are called the thalamic fasciculus. Okay. There are two ways that they can go to the thalamus. They can either go directly through the internal capsule, or they can loop around the internal capsule and go to the thalamus. If we go back to this picture, I think it's better to see. So if this is the internal globus pallidus, and then the thalamus is right here underneath the caudate, the fibers can either go directly through the internal capsule, or they can go the long way around, loop around the internal capsule and go to the thalamus. And so each of these fibers have different names. Together, they're called the thalamic fasciculus, but they have, you can divide them into two different things. You can divide them into the ansa lenticularis, so ansa lenticularis, or you can make the other one is called the lenticular fasciculus. Okay, so this is the two ways, the two tracts that are related from the globus pallidus internal to the thalamus, either ansa lenticularis or lenticular fascicularis, and together they're called the thalamic fasciculus. How do you know which one's which? Basically, ansa is the one that loops around. And how do you remember that? Think of it as nisa, ansa, as in, I forgot, nisa طريجة. فنسا طريجة فراح طريجها حيل around the internal capsule, looping around the internal capsule, going to the thalamus. And the other one is lenticular fasciculus. So again, ansa reticularis, the one that nisa طريجة, so loops around. And lenticular fasciculus is the one that just goes straight through the internal capsule. Together, they're known as the thalamic fasciculus. Okay, let's talk about the pathways now. You have two pathways in your basal ganglia. You have the direct and you have the indirect. I'm going to talk about the direct pathway first.